Let's take a closer look at the U.S. involvement in Egypt. The U.S. gives $1.3 billion in military aid and about $250 million in economic aid to Egypt every year. This week, the White House said it was reviewing whether aid should continue in light of the unrest and the government's crackdown on pro-Morsi protesters. So what lies ahead for U.S. aid to Egypt? Earlier, I spoke with Robert Naiman. He's the policy director at Just Foreign Policy, as well as Catherine Warrick, a professor of political science of the Middle East at Villanova University. I asked their thoughts on whether the U.S. can and should cut aid.
Well, I think that it is a difficult decision because this military aid and our assistance relationship is very long-standing with Egypt, and there's a lot of political advantage tied up in that. It's not clear that the aid gains us a lot of leverage, but ending the aid would be very deeply unpopular in Egypt, and the administration is already fairly unpopular. There's a very negative view of America in Egypt right now.
Dr. Naiman, let me get you to pick up on that, because Congress is going to come back after its summer vacation, and they're going to have to wrestle with, do they continue providing this $1.3 billion in aid? And there's going to be a lot of people, a lot of constituents saying, we should cut this off. The situation there is getting out of control. Your thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing that every American should know and everyone in the world should know is that we have clear, long-standing U.S. laws that require the aid to be cut off. U.S. aid to the Egyptian military should have been cut off immediately after the military coup. Long-standing U.S. law, democratically elected government overthrown by a military coup, U.S. military aid must cut off. We have other laws, the Leahy Law, the Arms Control Export Act. All of these say that U.S. aid should not be going to military and police forces that are committing massacres.
But Dr. Naiman,
in addition,
if I can cut you off just for a second there,
yeah.
Is the U.S. trying to get around that with the administration using its somewhat creative dialogue, saying, well, it's not really a coup, and we really don't know what has happened? Is that good enough?
Well, what they've said is, actually, they haven't said it's not really a coup. They've said, we've studied the law, and we've decided that we're not required to make a determination of whether it's a coup or not. So we're just not going to have a position on that question. That's completely unprecedented innovation on the Obama administration's part. Nobody accepts that as a matter of law. Mm-hmm. The only possible excuse for the administration's vacillation was their argument, look, let us, don't let us give up all our leverage, let us talk to the generals. But what we've seen again and again is that the generals ignored the United States and Europe at the urging of Saudi and Israeli officials who said, don't worry about the United States, call their bluff, they're not serious, they don't have the guts to cut off military aid. That happened before the coup, when the generals ignored the U.S. It happened before the massacres, when the generals ignored the U.S.
Okay,
so there's a question here. When you threaten, we're going to cut off military aid if you do a coup or if you do massacres, they do a coup, they do massacres, and then you do nothing, that makes you complicit in the coup and complicit in the massacres.
Dr. Warrick, what do you think about that? Because it sounds like Dr. Naiman is basically saying that the U.S. has a toothless policy right now in terms of saying, look, we're going to cry wolf until we get our way.
Well, it doesn't look like a strong policy at the moment, but the administration's in a really difficult position. I agree. For all intents and purposes, this was a coup and the law is clear. But if there are political concerns that would make it unwise for us to give up our aid relationship with Egypt, then I think the administration needs to make a much stronger case for that to the American people and be very explicit about it. I think that everyone knows it was a coup, and to fail to call it that and to fail to act on it looks like a failure to make policy, not an attempt to make very sophisticated policy.
Dr. Naiman, let's talk about, you've talked about the massacres, and today we know that the government cracked down on a number of protests. We didn't see that groundswell of support in the streets today. A lot of barbed wire, a lot of people out on the streets, a lot of military muscle. Is that going to be enough to muzzle the legions of people over there who are very frustrated with how things have played out?
That's the kind of thing that's impossible to predict. Over the short term, yeah, people see that protesters get massacres, maybe fewer people will show up to protest. But look, the Muslim Brotherhood existed in Egypt for years when it was illegal, when it was banned, when there was a climate of repression, when its leaders were arrested. So the idea that repression now is going to make this major political organization disappear, not to mention that, they're not the only Islamists in Egypt, as you judge from the elections to the parliament. So repression is not a way out for the Egyptian military, and it's not a way out for the United States or the West. There has to be a new political dispensation that includes Islamist political forces as long as they participate nonviolently in the democratic political game.
Dr. Warrick, when we talk about the U.S. funding to Egypt, it's not like a spigot that we could turn on or off. In fact, if you look at it, a lot of the $1.3 billion is going to contractors here in the D.C. area. We know
Indeed.
that the U.S. has withheld sending over 4 F-16s that they were supposed to send over, but earlier this year they did send over 8. Egypt is waiting for 8 others. What impact is this going to have on the country? Because this is a country that's basically fed up with conflict. How long can it go on? It's destroying their economy, destroying the environment over there.
Well, this explains why there is a large segment of the Egyptian population that supports the military-backed government, because people are very, very weary of conflict. But I think the conflict, as it continues to play out, isn't going to be solely with sort of military tactics and police repression. As the other speaker was saying, you know, that's going to be important, and that really can't continue. It's too expensive for the regime. But the other front that we see the regime engaging in this kind of repression on is the constitutional and political front. So it's not very likely that they're going to bring the other Islamist parties to the table, the smaller liberal parties to the table. The constitutional changes that are apparently in the works right now, that we're getting initial information about, suggest that they're going to ban religiously based parties entirely, and that they're not planning a kind of pacted transition or a political negotiation that would settle this. So it really is unclear where this is going, but I don't think sort of the military hardware is going to be the answer to this in the long run.
Great. Dr. Catherine Warrick, Dr. Robert Naiman, thanks very much for joining us. We could talk about this a great deal more. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.